Hello and welcome to this episode of the Beyond Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Crighton, and today we have The Road to Bosworth Field, a post-show discussion of Bosworth Field by Sir John Beaumont, performed live from the stage of the Quay Theatre, Sudbury. It was recorded before an audience on Thursday the 20th of July 2023, when the whole event was nearly derailed by a train strike, which we may refer to during the show. Apart from technical tweaks, this is the show as performed that summer day. You can listen to the poem Bosworth Field on the podcast now, as well as catch additional content about the text on the podcast and YouTube streams. Links are in the show description. But now I pass you over to past Robert to introduce the show. Enjoy. Hello. Welcome to the history part of the show. I'm your host, Robert Crighton, of the Beyond Shakespeare Podcast. Delighted to be here in the wonderful Quay Theatre in Sudbury for our look at the legacy of Bosworth and the literary and dramatic aftermath of the short reign of Richard III. Now, to help explore the history and the literature, I have brought some learned fellow travellers. Please welcome onto the stage our resident expert on literary Richard, Dr. Jitka Štollová. And joining us are readers for the second half, personifying so many Richards, a positive bushel of dicks, is our more general early modern expert, Dr. Stephen Longstaffe, with actors Sarah Golding and Karim Kronfli. So, Richard III, an uncontroversial king, didn't kill any children. Not one, especially not two. Nope. Now, for the record, we are not getting into the princes in the tower here, except to say that everybody in the early modern period believed he killed them. I don't think any of the texts that we look at posit a shadow of a doubt on that point. And that is the area we're coming from here. But King Richard does have a more variable reputation as a king. As you heard in the poem, he dies in 1485 at Bosworth, and Henry Tudor, Henry VII of that name, comes to the throne. And from that point onwards, Richard's life sort of becomes history, it becomes literature, it becomes storytelling, and these things all get a bit muddled together, leading up to the poem Bosworth Field in 1629. But there's quite a gap between his death and the poem we did tonight. So let's build a road to Bosworth. Let's hear a little bit from a literary Richard. So take one of our Richards, take it away.
A king I was, and Richard was my name, born to a crown when first my life began. My thoughts ambitious ventured for the same, and from my nephews I was the kingdom won. Nor do I think that this my honour stained. A crown I sought, and I a kingdom gained. Time tyrant fate did fit me for a crown. My father's fall did teach me to aspire. He meant by force his brother to put down, that so himself might hap to rise the higher. And what he lost by fortune I have won. A duke the father, yet a king the son. My father, Richard, Duke of York, was called. 3 sons he had, all matchless at that time. I, Richard, youngest to them both, was thralled, yet 2 of us unto the crown did climb. Edward and I this realm as kings did hold, but George of Clarence could not, though he would.
And that is from The Rising to the Crown of Richard III, written by himself, via Giles Fletcher. That was written around 1593, which gives us a few clues as to where Richard is placed in terms of reputation 100 and a bit years later after his death. So for this issue, I'm going to turn to my first guest, who's made a study of the literary reputation of Richard III, and you are...
Hello, I'm Jitka Štollová. I'm a Title A Fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and my project for my first monograph is studying Richard III in the 17th century, in all sorts of texts and visual arts as well.
So, Who is Richard? Even before he appears on paper, people are telling stories about him. Who is he immediately after his death in 1485?
Well, that's really curious because Richard immediately after his death becomes a myth, really. The moment his body is flung over a horse and taken to Leicester from the Bosworth battlefield, he becomes a myth. The earliest accounts, we might say, obviously we have historiography, someone like Polydor Virgil, but really the earliest sources are ballads, and especially one called Lady Bessie, which is a very curious example of how a woman decides to get married, get a husband, and just defeat a tyrant single-handedly, basically.
Yeah, we're very fond of the song of Lady Bessie, the future wife to Henry, and yeah, it's very much all about pester power as she goes to her father-in-law or her future father-in-law and says, "Oh, can you give me the king? Could you marry me off and get me the kingdom? It'd be lovely." And we're going to hear a little bit of that now. So Stephen will be reading Stanley, her future father-in-law, who she calls father already in this text, don't ask too many questions. And Lady Bessie will be performed by Sarah Golding. So Bessie's going to talk about her father, Edward IV, her uncles and the two princes, her brothers, and her father, then warns her about saying such things in case Richard hears.
"Oh, Father Stanley, do you, I call, for the love of God, remember thee, since my father, King Edward, that king royal, at Westminster on his deathbed lee. He called to him my uncle Richard, so he did Robert of Brackenbury and James Terrell, he was the third. He sent them to Ludlow in the West Country to fetch the Duke of York and the Duke of Clarence, these two lords born of a high degree. The Duke of York should have been a prince and king after my father free, but a baleful game was then among, when they doomed these two lords to die. They had neither justice nor right, but had a great wrong. Alack, it was the more pity. Neither were they buried in St. Mary's, in church or churchyard or holy place. Alas, they had doleful destinies. Hard was their chance, worse was their disgrace. Therefore, help, good Father Stanley, while you have space, for the love of God and mild Mary, or else in time to come you shall, alas, remember the words of Lady Bessie."
"Good Lady Bessie, be content. For though your words be never so sweet, if King Richard knew, you must be shent, and perchance cast into prison deep. Then had you cause to wail and weep, and wring your hands with heavy cheer. Therefore, good lady, I beseech to move me no more in this matter."
So the whole invasion is pressed by Lady Elizabeth herself, according to this text, and this was written relatively soon after Bosworth itself, and is casting an interesting light on the whole Stanley family, which is something we might get into a little bit later on. It's quite complicated. But there is a bit of an elephant in the room here of the physical depiction of Richard, and one of the earliest, most monstrous, coming from the account by Sir Thomas More, and it's a response to this and some other person who may have leapfrogged that idea. That is perhaps the greatest reason why people want Richard to be this nice guy. But I think we should have a little example of More's description of Richard in comparison with his brothers.
Richard, the third son, of whom we now entreat, was in wit and courage equal with either of them. In body and prowess far under them both. Little of stature, ill-featured of limbs. Crooked-backed, his left shoulder much higher than his right. Hard-favoured of visage, and such as in states called warly. In other men, otherwise, he was malicious, wrathful, envious, and from afore his birth ever froward. It is for truth reported that the Duchess his mother had so much ado in her travail that she could not be delivered of him uncut. and that he came into the world with feet forward, as men be born outward, and, as the fame runneth, also not untoothed. Whether men of hatred report above the truth, or else that nature changed her course in his beginning, which in the course of his life many things unnaturally committed.
Now, some writers run with this, and some don't. Some mention this kind of ableist discourse in passing, and some people really dive in and go for it. And it gets repeated in various different forms as chronicles start coming about. I don't know who wants to leap in on chronicles or anything here. Stephen, did you want to leap in on chronicles?
Well, the chronicles are great big baggy things, and it's perhaps convenient for the writers that they don't always make much of a pretense of editing the materials they're putting together. And so what they do is they will often jam things together, and they may not actually fit with one another. So, King John has got about 8 different causes of death in the chronicles, for example. And so you find out an awful lot of stories. You find out an awful lot of versions, and these things sometimes, and these things don't agree. And so it is with Richard in different ways that the chronicles will say seemingly contradictory things about him. That, as was mentioned in the poem, I think that at one point that he was, making good laws and he was setting the nation aright. And sometimes the chronicles play up this, and sometimes they don't.
And so there are some things we might say positive things we get from Moore and other texts is Richard's ability at war. No one ever doubts that he's a good fighter, a brave fighter, especially considering his relatively slight build. Yeah, any thoughts on his fighting prowess? Anyone want to leap in on that?
The story of who he killed on the way in and grabbing the standard and so forth, this seems to have gripped people. That does turn up in, for example, in the Latin play Richardus Tertius about Richard, this kind of valiant last stand, if you like. And it's a way of kind of complicating the end of the story a little bit, I think, that, he... If he could have been fighting the French instead of the English, that would have been a pretty good thing, as it says in Richardus Tertius. So it's a strange kind of. It works very well dramatically, doesn't it? To have somebody who at the end, has this kind of dramatic final scene.
Yes, you've mentioned Richardus Tertius, which is a 3-part epic Latin play, which we haven't done, oddly enough. But anyone want to leap in on all 3 parts?
Well, yeah, it's good because you're a lightweight. Richardus Tertius is one of the accounts of Richard that doesn't really make anything of the physical disability. It mentions, this is a three-parter. It's a trilogy. It mentions in passing in one line that he had a withered arm, but that play really isn't interested in that. It's not interested in building him up to be this kind of bugbear figure. It's very much more interested in a kind of rise and fall, and it's put on at St John's in Cambridge, and it's written by a guy called Legg, who was briefly the vice chancellor of Cambridge. And Cambridge colleges or Oxford colleges at this point had huge resources, sometimes rivaling the royal court themselves. And so this is not so much the story of one man as the chance to fill the stage with flags. There's a cast of over 100, and a lot of the stage directions are mute people rush over the stage. Soldiers chase them back to the other side. It's the kind of 16th century equivalent of special effects. And so, it's being played in the hall. It literally have guns going off during the battle. They literally bring a horse on for Richard to take Richard's body off with. So no expense is spared. So spectacle is one of the things that they see first when they're trying to recreate this past period. It's not solely a literary approach, even though it's heavily reliant on Latin and Greek authors.
And so there's also something in a lot of these texts where there's a sort of an overreach, which is Richard is made guilty personally for things he was probably just complicit in, like the taking out of Henry VI. So we've got a little bit more from Thomas More on this.
He slew with his own hands King Henry VI, being prisoner in the Tower, as men constantly say, and that without commandment or knowledge of the king, which would undoubtedly, if he had intended that thing, have appointed that butcherly office to some other than his own born brother.
Yes, as men constantly say, is doing rather a lot of work there. And there's something about Moore's account, which is a lot of it does seem to be based on a certain level of scurrilous gossip, which is sometimes taken with a pinch of salt and sometimes not. And of course, they're good stories, so they get passed on. But I say, killing of Richard by Richard is a bit of a pass-off. It's the kind of, I'm sure the king may have wanted plausible deniability, but Edward IV was very much in on that, as he was with the killing of Clarence. That's very much Edward IV was quite happy to get rid of him because he had it coming, frankly. But in both cases, political actions that Richard was implicated in, but he didn't necessarily physically do. And of course, Henry VI appeared as a ghost in Bosworth Field. And we have a whole tradition of lamenting ghosts in a book called The Mirror for Magistrates, which covers Richard's reign rather a lot, written in the early years of Elizabeth. It sort of started before then, but it really gets published and becomes a thing. Jitka, thoughts on The Mirror for Magistrates?
It was such a bestseller, really so popular, formed after Boccaccio's De Casibus on the Fall of Man, and really you have ghosts emerging from the grave, giving their story, usually a very pitiful story, something they were usually responsible for their death, not absolutely 100%, but basically most of the time, coming to tell you how to avoid their fate going down, which exactly already becomes quite a problematic issue, because we have got something going on here in this country that's called the Reformation. So the status of the place from which these ghosts are emerging is very theologically loaded. Nevertheless, we have these ghosts who emerge, and what's important is that what they deliver is basically a version of dramatic soliloquies. And you can see why they really influence later Elizabethan drama and drama beyond that. This is exactly what the theatre really needs, someone to stand there, give in a nutshell their story, and then disappear, basically.
We're going to have a little example from Mirror for Magistrates. Here's a bit of Richard lamenting as he talks about murdering children.
Desire to rule made me, alas, to rue. My fatal fall I could not it foresee. Puffed up in pride, so haughty then I grew, that none my peer I thought now could be, disdaining such as were of high degree. Thus daily rising and pulling other down, at last I shot how to win the crown, and daily devising which was the best way, and mean how I might my nephews both devour. I secretly then sent, without further delay, to Brackenbury, then Lieutenant of the Tower, requesting him by letters to help unto his power, for to accomplish this my desire and will, and that he would secretly my brother's children kill. He answered plainly with a flat nay, saying that to die he would not do that deed. What though he refused, yet be sure you may that other were as ready to take in hand the thing, which watched and waited as duly for their prey as ever did the cat for the mouse taking, and how they might their purpose best to pass bring, which Tyrrell he thought good to have no blood shed, becast them to kill by smothering in their bed, which when I heard, my heart I felt was eased of grudge, of grief, of inward deadly pain. But with this deed the nobles were displeased, and said, "O God, shall such a tyrant reign, that hath so cruelly his brother's children slain?" Which bruit once blown in the people's ears, their dolour was such that they burst out in tears. But what thing may suffice unto the bloody man? The more he bathes in blood, the bloodier he is alway.
And as I said earlier, literally no one doubts that he was responsible for their deaths. This kind of autobiographical lamentation is probably the inspiration for a whole epic poem, The Ghost of Richard III, which tells his life story from beyond the grave. We've done a certain amount of work on The Ghost of Richard III. Jitka.
Well, I think, you have done a lot of work on that, being Richard. It's a fantastic poem, I think, written by Christopher Brooke in 1614. It tries to revive this, at this point, quite obsolete tradition of the Mirror of Magistrates poems. It was written by an MP at a time when Parliament was having a bit of a disagreement with the king. It's related to the adult Parliament issue. Just imagine if we had MPs who would just write a poem about tyranny and to try to communicate a message. Anyway, I would really quite appreciate that. Richard emerges, gives this very interesting version of himself. The reason why it's so interesting is that he's really quite original. He takes a lot of the witticism and sophistication that we already find in that character. Richard is not an idiot. He might be a murderer, sure, but he's not an idiot. And he really pushes that forward and gives us a sense of how he educated himself consciously into tyranny, to be able to watch people dying, for example. So there is an element of intellect and sophistication which we don't really find in the earlier portraits. And I find that quite creepy and quite admirable in the combination, as it were.
Yes, we did a performance of it on this stage during lockdown. And one of the interesting things he works his way up into nulling his senses. It's very much like reading an account of a serial killer, because he starts with animals and he works up to watching people being executed, and it's really dark. It's great. So anyway, all of these poems in books, these lamentations by ghosts, and in Mirror for Magistrates, these lamentations are often called tragedies, and so that brings us to a pucker tragedy, the wonderful play, The True Tragedy. A lot of work on true, again there. The True Tragedy of Richard III, which was a play produced by the Queen's Men, who were the supergroup of its day, the Dirty Dozen of acting. And Stephen actually has essayed Lord Stanley in our readings for True Tragedy online. So can you tell us a little bit about the playing company that created the True Tragedy, the Queen's Men?
Yeah, so the Queen's Men, as Robert says, were a kind of supergroup that were formed in 1583 to provide entertainment at court. Entertainment at court had got a little bit expensive, and so the way that they decided to deal with this problem was to basically outsource. So instead of having lots and lots of performers and carpenters and backstage people employed at the court all the time, they decided to create a theatre company which would mostly live off its own endeavours and then just come to court for the holidays, Christmas and Easter and times like that. And it was a plan agreed by the Queen with leading councillors, and so most of these councillors had their own theatre companies which travelled under their passport, as it were. And so Leicester's Men, I think, the Earl of Leicester provided about half of them, but they picked the best players, basically. And the idea was that not only would they have the Queen's name behind them, but they would be a supergroup and everybody would want to go and see them. And they would live off touring. And this is interesting, I guess, from the point of view of Richard III, because they would mostly tour around the country. So there was an East Anglian circuit, which was Ipswich, Aldborough, Norwich, Saffron Walden, Lynn, Kirtling and Cambridge, and that was quite a regular touring circuit. But they also played in the north, and in fact the Queen's Men are mentioned, I think, 3 or 4 times as playing up in Knowsley, the current seat of the Stanley family. And the Stanley family, you may have noticed, were making quite a large appearance in this story. And so the story of Richard III, we need to remember that the families that were fighting, we heard the word Beaumont, didn't we? We heard the name Beaumont. Beaumont is the writer. They're still around, a lot of these families. And in particular, the Stanleys were in need of a little bit of a reputation boost, because the Stanleys had kind of found themselves not necessarily on the right side of the next 100 years. So the present Earl of Derby, who is the fourth Earl of Derby, the first Earl of Derby is the Stanley in the poem. Two of his uncles are in the Tower in 1570 for plotting on behalf of Mary, Queen of Scots. Just before they go up to South Lancashire to do this, potentially to play their Richard III play, which bigs up the Stanleys. Another member of the family who was in command of a garrison in the Low Countries had actually switched sides and gone over to the Spanish and spent the 1590s trying to organise assassinations of the Queen. So what better to certainly be doing the rounds under the imprimis, under the name of the Queen's Men, than a play which, like the poem that we've been listening to, accentuates the positive of the Stanley family.
Yes, and this goes back, as I say, to Lady Bessie, and the Stanleys. There are two Stanleys. It's slightly befuddled in the poem. There are two Stanleys. There's Thomas Stanley and there's William. And in the earlier accounts, William is the one who is much more important than Bosworth, and is there and gives the crown to Henry after the battle. And then William, during the reign of Henry, it all goes a bit wrong and he sort of gets killed. So the story sort of slightly shifts a little bit towards his brother Thomas, and things get a bit muddled. And so we often talk about Tudor propaganda is something people say about accounts of Richard III, but it's family propaganda is what sort of the emphasis that we're playing with here. The Stanleys are very keen on projecting their idea of who they are, even when it's often not wholly true. And I love the true tragedy. It's quite subversive in many ways. And the play shows us Richard not as an overtly evil figure. It's someone who's drawn into the role of tyrant, in part by his followers. We have a little reading here with some of his followers. We have a follower, Catesby.
Renowned and right worthy protector, whose excellency far deserves the name of king than protector, Sir William Catesby wisheth, my lord, that your grace may be so govern the young prince, that the crown of England may flourish in all happiness.
He's not king yet. None of this has happened yet. And then there are others around him say,
May it please your majesty.
Villain, majesty.
I speak but on that which shall be, my good lord.
Sirrah, give place. How this title of majesty animates me to my purpose. Why now, fortune make me a king. Fortune give me a kingdom. Let the world report that the Duke of Gloucester was a king. Therefore, fortune me a king. If I be but king for a year, nay, but half a year, nay, a month, a week, 3 days, 1 day, half a day, nay, an hour, zoons, half an hour. Nay, sweet fortune, clap but the crown on my head, that the vassals may but once say, God save King Richard's life. It is enough.
At the beginning of the play, he really wasn't thinking about any of these things. And so the play's as much about people enabling and pushing tyranny and assisting him in becoming more tyrannous. And of course, later on, when he becomes king, he unravels even more. And there's all these themes and thoughts rushing through his head. Jitka, you have some thoughts on where Richard is later on in the play.
Yeah, I think you have already noticed how very focused Richard becomes on particular words. He really becomes invested in the word, from protector to king, and then negotiating to the tiniest amount of time that would allow him to be a king. What happens afterwards is basically it comes at a moment which, again, basically all the chronicles cover, that once Richard reaches the crown, kills the princes, or simply the princes are gone, he begins to crumble. That's recorded in the earliest of sources we have. That's one of those shared themes, similarly with the courage at the battlefield. And at that point, which we will now listen to, there he is also very focused on a particular word, but it is not king. the word is revenge, revenge, revenge. Revenge sounds in his mind, and it becomes a very hugely complex, wonderfully complex image of revenge, which is both claustrophobic because every single line ends with revenge. Richard cannot escape revenge. But also that imagery, which is developed using that word revenge, acquires universal proportions. It goes from smaller things to literally the space and stars, and then to lambs, and like absolutely everything is after Richard. So it's both claustrophobic and universal, and this very complex metaphor of revenge literally traps and crushes Richard.
And we're going to hear Karim as Richard with that speech.
The hell of life that hangs upon the crown, the daily cares, the nightly dreams, the wretched cruise, the treason of the foe, and horror of my bloody practice past, strike such a terror to my wounded conscience that sleep I, wake I, or whatsoe'er I do, methinks their ghosts come gaping for revenge. Whom I have slain in reaching for a crown, Clarence complains and crieth for revenge. My nephew's bloods, revenge, revenge doth cry. The headless peers come pressing for revenge, and every one cries, let the tyrant die. The sun by day shines hotly for revenge, the moon by night eclipseth for revenge. The stars are turned to comets for revenge, the planets change their courses for revenge. The birds sing not but sorrow for revenge, the silly lambs sit bleating for revenge. The screeking raven sits croaking for revenge, whole herds of beasts come bellowing for revenge. And all, yea, all the world, I think, cries for revenge, and nothing but revenge. But to conclude, I have deserved revenge.
And in the play, he isn't just killed, and we're left with Henry VII as a sort of Christ-like saviour. One of his followers, an unnamed page, actually mourns him, and we hear the page speaking to a figure called Report, who's sort of basically a reporter on the battlefield, asking what's going on. The page speaks about Richard's end and how he was your master.
But stay, Report, and thou shalt hear me tell the brief discourse and how the battle fell. Then know, Report, that Richard came to field mounted on horseback, with as high resolve as fierce Achilles, mongst the sturdy Greeks, whom to encounter worthy Richmond came accompanied with many followers. And then, my lord, displayed his colours straight, and with the charge of trumpet, drum and fife, those brave battalions straight encountered. But in the skirmish, which continued long, my lord gone faint, which Richmond straight perceived, and presently did sound a fresh alarm. But worthy Richard, that did never fly, but followed honour to the gates of death, straight spurred his horse to encounter with the Earl, in which encounter Richmond did prevail. And taking Richard at advantage, then he threw his horse and him both to the ground, and there was worthy Richard wounded, so that after that he ne'er recovered strength. But to be brief, my master would not yield, but with his loss of life he lost the field. Report, farewell.
And again, he fights bravely at the end. So he turns up rather a lot on stage, probably more than we actually have surviving plays. There are a lot of history plays bouncing around. He does turn up again in part 2 of Thomas Heywood's Edward IV. And there's a lost Ben Jonson text. Lost, or he never actually got round to writing it due to death. And finally, we reach tonight's poem, Bosworth Field. It's not the only battle to get some love. Other battle poems are available. Other battles are out there. Stephen, do we have anything on battle poetry?
Well, a writer called Michael Drayton wrote a ballad of Agincourt, which he later kind of thought he could make more of and came up with a 320-stanza, huge kind of DVD extras with extra commentary version. The original ballad is quite short. One of the interesting things there is that Beaumont, the writer of our poem, is a friend of Drayton's, and so Drayton's work comes out first. The interesting thing, I suppose, about Agincourt as compared to this poem is that it's a fairly straightforwardly gung-ho, or the ballad is fairly straightforwardly gung-ho. Yes, this is a great noble victory. And what we have in this is a little bit more nuanced, I think. So we do have some forebears, and we have in things in manuscript that those great families would produce work on their own kind of lineage and things that the family have been involved in. So it's possible that there may have been a more common practice than we have records of now.
Yes, so we've got a bit of context. It's not just Richard, other things. So Bosworth Field, what makes this text unique? Jitka?
I think it's quite interesting to look at the story of the writer himself, Sir John Beaumont. He was the brother of the playwright Francis Beaumont, who was one half of a very famous duo, John Fletcher, so the Knight of the Burning Pestle, possibly, you might know. And John Beaumont is not well known, although he did write a few poems and even a masque. Partly the reason was that he was quite persecuted because of his religion. He was a Catholic, which at that point meant that he was not just free to travel wherever he wished. He needed to get special permission, for example, when his brother died, to be able to go to London. And he was living very, very close to Leicester and the battlefield. And I do think, that's my theory, that some of the stories we get about those one-on-one encounters might have leaked from personal stories, because this is the horizon of memory that still exists in that country, which has this huge story that people talk about over and over and over again. And he is buried in the Poets' Corner in London, and he was possibly shaped by the fact that he was, and of course his brother, they were brought up at a place called Quay Theatre, which used to be a monastery. Then Henry VIII came, and yes, there was no monastery. But someone like William Wordsworth actually wrote poems about the place and was remembering these two brothers as really quite wonderful poets of their times. So there's a lot behind him, even though he feels like a forgotten name. Actually, he is recognized to a degree.
And of course, he's living essentially a divided life. These are people who we have made divided families, and there's lots in this text which are sort of future echoes for the coming civil. I mean, nobody really knows the civil war is coming, but they do know what a war in the past was like, and it's one of these things of saying, don't let a civil war start, because they're really, really awful, which he does go into a lot in this text. Anymore, otherwise I'm going to start going into wider questions, also going to the audience. We're going to open a few questions to the room, also to other people on the panel. There's sort of various thoughts and themes that we're sort of playing around with. I'm really interested in the story of Norfolk from the poem, and his son Surrey. This is a guy who doesn't want to fight for Richard, and he does it because he swore an oath. He doesn't like Richard, can't stand him, but he still fights, and he dies, and his son sees that happen. And this whole question of duty and honour: do you do your duty, or do you get rid of an arsehole? It's a real question. I think the other thing I was really interested in was the fact that this poem really makes the case that this is a French invasion. that a lot of the incoming troops are not English, and in fact, Henry's Welsh, and there are other people in that force as well. Any thoughts from the panel before I ask the room if there are any questions? You see, I say all these things, vamping to see if someone else has something else, and then they all sit there and look at me.
Is the Welsh thing what the Merlin kind of jibe is about then? So Merlin is this kind of ancient bard, and this is what's going to happen. Everyone's going to be walking around in sandals eating tofu sort of idea, so we let these...
And again, we have this moment where the poem pauses and they say, well, here's all the fighting, but this is what happens when two friends fight on opposite sides. And again, it's this future echoes of civil war that's quite... And it's like the poem just stops and it just zooms in on these two just going... and Clifton, I think it's Clifton, is making this point of, my family's been... done very badly in similar circumstances to this before, and we've lost everything. Make sure it doesn't happen again. And so, again, these echoes dancing around. Everyone's just agreeing with me. Good. House lights up. Any questions from the audience? I was going to pass the microphone around. I can't be bothered. Anyone on the panel on that point about history written by the winners?
This is quite a good example of a poem which has its agenda in the sense that it's pro-monarchy, pro-James, then pro-Charles. That's obvious from the other poems published in this collection. And yet, it's so very balanced. I mean, I've read a lot about Richard III in the 17th century, and some of it is really not very good at all. And this is one of the best pieces I have found, and it's one of the most balanced pieces. And partly, one of the reasons is that it shows this conflict not as some sort of a macho clash of Richard and Richmond, as it is done in so many other texts, but really you do have a sense of a conflict which is tearing through the society, ripping families apart. Some sort of elite conflict where people just have to participate and they try to live their lives in the midst of it. And I think this is what takes the edge of any portrayal of Richard as a monster, because yes, people did choose to fight for him or had to or whatever. It was just so much more balanced than some of the other texts show.
And we do have, there are other plays where, there are French invasions, for example, where they try really hard not to mention that the French are there. I mean, this does actually bring it up and actually has a whole random paragraph all about it. But we're going to just go to quick final thoughts. So this account is perhaps not necessarily fully balanced, but it's more varied than people think. Jitka, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I will never cease to be amazed by the final words that Richard utters and the almost filmic focus on his gesture when he says, "Now strength, no longer fortune can withstand. I perish in the center of my land." So he positions his strength against fortune. Fortune can be fickle. So this doesn't feel like a grand victory of the Tudors. It's just how that particular battle turned out. And I love then what follows, the grasping gesture of him holding the hand, because he truly believes that he has the right to that land. That's quite fantastic. And when you blend that idea of, I belong to my country belongs to me, versus, and there are invaders from France, Brittany and Wales. Well, it really creates quite a complex message, which slightly, it colors the primitive notion of a tyrant that some of the other texts simply have.
And of course, all of these accounts, some of them are crossing over between fiction and history. They're a medley of ideas that are all people are reacting to 100, 150 years after his death. It's even more complicated now because we actually have modern archaeology. We actually know what he's like. And people have dug greater depth into the archives. Stephen, any final thoughts?
Well, the archaeology thing, I suppose, is interesting because we've been talking about the way that, history and literature and oral forms like the ballads, and they all kind of, they're telling stories, and we kind of want there to be a truth. And Richard's, when I started working on historical stuff 30 years ago, it was quite strongly held that Richard had been, the Tudors had done the dirty on him, and there was a piece about a portrait which had, they'd found through a sort of X-ray vision that the hump had been painted onto it, and this shows that all of this stuff is just kind of Tudor propaganda writing, the victors writing the histories. And then, of course, he's dug up in this car park, Greyfriars in Leicester, and we know it's him because of the DNA, and the skeleton has scoliosis, and so it has a twisted spine. And the interesting thing about the archaeology as well, I suppose, is we do have accounts of Richard's death. What the archaeology tells us is that there are almost no wounds on the body, so he's probably got plate armour covering him. There's a lot of wounds on the head. There's 9 or 10 wounds. 3 or 4 of those could have been the fatal blow. Somebody took the back of his head off with an axe or something like that. They didn't stop until they were really, really sure he was dead. As most of the wounds are to the head, but one of the wounds, the story of Richard is his body is stripped and it's taken on the back of a horse into Leicester. And so one of the wounds is actually a sword wound in the bum. So it didn't happen during the battle. It happened when it's a kind of defilement, final kind of indignity visited upon Richard. And there can't have been an awful lot left of his head, put it that way. His head was mashed up really badly, but somebody felt the need, as his dead body is over the back of the horse, to give one final kind of blow. And the archaeology tells us that. We might not have believed it if that little detail had been in a chronicle, So actually the archaeology does confirm, as it were, the vibe of the chronicles. You saw us gathering round him. It wasn't a fair fight. It didn't matter how good he was, mano a mano. That was the end. And that, so the great thing about it is knowledge is always churning and always evolving, and that's one of the things that makes it so exciting.
And sadly, we have run over massively, but also run out of time. Both of those things, they go together. All that remains is to thank all our guests, Sarah Golding, Karim Kronfli, Dr. Stephen Longstaffe, Dr. Jitka. Thank you very much, and good night! The Road to Bosworth Field was recorded live at the Quay Theatre in Sudbury, with thanks to Joe Fawcett, Jack Lawson, Sharon Buckler, and the rest of the theatre team. The episode was hosted by myself, Robert Crighton. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram at Beyond Shakes. Visit our website at beyondshakespeare.org or support our work by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare. Goodbye.